Now, in another bid to ease spiraling tensions, US President Joe Biden spoke to his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin for close to an hour, where they exchanged warnings over Ukraine. This is their second conversation this month, and while no breakthrough occurred in the talks, both presidents indicated support for further diplomacy on the tense standoff between Russia and the West. While Biden said he needed to see Russia de-escalate the military build-up near Ukraine, Putin said that anti-Moscow sanctions would be a colossal mistake. Despite the talk of diplomacy, officials on both sides later described that the tone of the call was serious, and neither side admitted to any significant progress towards a resolution. Biden, according to senior US officials, laid out two paths. One was diplomacy, the other path more focused on deterrence. That would include serious costs and consequences. The possibilities include measures that would effectively disconnect Russia from the global economic and financial system. The phone call between the two leaders for now has set the stage for lower-level engagements between the two countries, the first of which is scheduled on the 10th of January, an in-person security meeting between US and Russian officials in Geneva, followed by a Russia-NATO session on the 12th of January, and a broader conference including Moscow, Washington and other European countries on the 13th of January. Russia's foreign ministry spelled out clearly what Moscow wants from the January talks. Let's listen in.
Переговоров будем добиваться от американской стороны предоставления твердых правовых гарантий безопасности Российской Федерации, а именно не продвижение НАТО на восток и не размещение угрожающих России систем вооружений у рубежов нашей страны.
Washington and its European allies accuse Russia of threatening Ukraine with a new invasion. Some 100,000 troops, Russian troops, are massed near the border, and while Russia denies having any invasion plans, the West remains skeptical. After all, Russia already seized the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 and is accused of supporting pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine. In exchange for withdrawing troops and de-escalating tensions, Russia has put forth a set of demands. It had put forth a set of demands earlier this month, which includes a bar on new US military bases in former territories of the Soviet Union. The US, in turn, has rejected what it called a bid by Moscow to dictate independent countries' futures. Despite ongoing dialogue, the status quo remains unchanged. Now, Spencer Krishley, author of Patriots of Two Nations and former communication advisor for former President Barack Obama's presidential campaign, is joining us live from California. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Now, as I mentioned, no breakthroughs during these talks. What can you tell us about the tone set for the talks going forward as well?
Well, I think we should all be very deeply concerned. I was glad to hear President Biden lay out these two tracks so clearly. He firmly spelled out the threat of very severe sanctions to Mr. Putin, and I think those sanctions would be targeted not so much at the Russian people, but at the people at the top of Russian society who have been siphoning the wealth off and essentially into their own pockets, becoming some of the richest people in the world. And I think it's important to maintain that distinction between the Russian people and the unfortunate choice of government they have right now, which was not their choice. On the other hand, if there is a choice to go down the diplomatic route, Mr. Biden made it very clear that that is wide open. And frankly, one of the greatest lost opportunities of recent history, I would say, was when the Soviet Union collapsed and there was an opportunity for Russia and the other former Soviet states to join the world community of democracies. And it just collapsed, unfortunately, into essentially a kleptocracy. And I believe the West bungled that transition as well. And now we have to try to get back to that lost opportunity.
Right, absolutely. Also, like I said, the stage is now set for lower-level engagement between the two sides. There are talks planned in January, 3 of them, in fact, 10th, 12th, and on the 13th. What can you tell us about that? What can we expect going forward now?
Well, of course, I don't have access to what's being planned inside the White House and the State Department, and certainly not what they're thinking in Russia. But I think that President Biden will continue, as he has, to lead with both values and realpolitik. You know, the realistic view of politics that dates back centuries brings to mind people like Bismarck. and the great game among nations, unfortunately often, but it's the realistic contest of interests among nations. But at the same time, the United States bases its power on its values, as President Biden has said so often. And I think President Biden is very strong on this score in being realistic, but recognizing we must lead with values. As he says often, it's not the power of the United States, the military power or economic power of the United States that makes the United States influential. It's the values. It's the example of the values. And of course, that example has been very severely shaken in recent years. And that's another thing we have to recover from.
Right. Also, just for more clarity on this, we know that Russia has put forth certain demands. Now, speaking of the tensions on the Ukrainian and the military buildup on the Ukrainian border, how do you reckon the situation will unfold?
You know, as again, cautioning, I'm more of an expert in terms of communication and media culture and the political side of this. But it looks to me fairly clear that what Vladimir Putin has been doing since he took power has been trying to restore the Russian Empire. And he's said that explicitly himself, including just this past summer with the famous essay that he published. And if you look at a map of the USSR and then post-USSR Russia and the moves that Vladimir Putin has been making in Georgia, in taking the Crimea back, as he sees it, taking it back from Ukraine, threatening Ukraine, cyber attacks in the Baltic states, having a very close ally and imitator now in Belarus, you're looking at somebody who's expanding back into the former borders of the USSR and its satellites. And I think that should be deeply concerning to everybody. There is no threat to Russia from NATO. There is a threat to Vladimir Putin to having legitimate popular democracies right on his border. That's the true threat that he faces.
Right. Mr. Spencer Creshley, thank you so much for joining us with all your inputs on that.
My pleasure. Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.